Well, good morning and welcome to the Brookings Institution. I appreciate you're all here on time despite the time change, so that's impressive. Highly intelligent audience. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to be moderating and I guess introducing these three gentlemen here who have produced this fascinating book called Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. There's nothing more difficult than trying to write what is in effect contemporary history to analyze an administration while it is still in place. Such an endeavor must be taken with a bit of modesty and humility, and these gentlemen have all displayed that, I think. Everyone knows that things are going to be seen differently in the future than they have been, than they may be now. I'm reminded of a book that I recall from the Reagan years by Doyle McManus and Jane Mayer called Landslide, and it was written sort of right at the height of the Iran-Contra crisis. And the basic thesis of the book was that Reagan's presidency was finished. He was going to go down in history as a total disaster. And I always look back on that as one of the perils of trying to predict the future based on what is happening at exactly this moment. So, but I think all these authors are aware of that issue as they've approached this. Let me just introduce the authors. On my right is Martin Indyk. I guess they're all on my right. Vice President, Director of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, my boss, all of our bosses, so I have to interview my boss here, tell him what he thinks, ask him what he thinks about his book. Ken Lieberthal, Director of the John L. Thornton China Center, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy and Global Economy and Development at Brookings. And on the far right is Mike O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at Brookings, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, use of military force, homeland security, and American foreign policy. All of these gentlemen are highly experienced. They've been practitioners as well as scholars and bring a real wealth of understanding, I think, and particularly in dealing with an issue like this, trying to evaluate a president's foreign policy, they bring a lot of historical and comparative understanding, because I think it's very easy to look at a presidency either in isolation or only in comparison to the last presidency. But of course, there is a broader historical context in which we have to look at the Obama administration, and this book really does put it in that context. So I thought I would just try to start a discussion here, talk about some of the issues that are raised in the book, and then I'll ultimately open it up to you for your questions as well. I wanted to start with the basic concept that, and Martin, maybe I'll ask you to describe the concept. I think you describe Obama as a pragmatic progressive. A progressive pragmatic? Which is it?
Progressive pragmatist.
A progressive pragmatist. Is that different from a pragmatic progressive? We'll have to explore that. But
the answer is no.
The answer is no. Okay. I have to say I'm always suspicious when I hear the word pragmatic. Because in the first place, people generally think that whatever they're doing is pragmatic and whatever people who disagree with them is doing is not pragmatic. But more generally, I always want to know pragmatic into what end? What is the purpose of pragmatism? I don't think, it seems to me a tactic rather than a doctrine, and it seems to me that pragmatism ought to head in some direction. In the book, I often see the definition of pragmatism seems to be maintaining good relations with dictators. That's described as a pragmatic policy on several occasions in this book. But having said that, why don't you, I'd love to hear what your definition of that phrase is.
Well, first of all, the title of the book, Bending History, is taken as an adaptation of President Obama's favorite quotation. He even has it embroidered in his rug in the Oval Office, which is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. from his famous speech in Montgomery, Alabama, in which he was asking rhetorically, how long will it take? And he says, how long? He says, not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And the fact that this is Barack Obama's favorite quote, and he uses it, as we explain in the book, on several very important occasions, like when Hosni Mubarak steps down as president of Egypt. It's I think, emblematic of the president's own view of what he is trying to achieve. And that's the progressive side of him. As Mike can explain in greater detail, he spent a lot of time on the campaign trail, not just distinguishing himself from George W. Bush, but laying out a vision, a broad and dramatic vision, not just for changing the country, but for changing the world, for improving the world. And this is Barack Obama's progressive vision, in which he sees a more humble United States adjusting to the changes in the balance of power in a way that would preserve the liberal international order that you have spoken so much about in your recent book, but would do so in the process of shaping an emerging global order that involves new powers, in particular China, but others as well, India and Turkey, but in the process maintains the liberal international order and bends it towards justice and freedom and progress and prosperity. And that vision, which he sold to the American people and he sold to much of the world as well, not surprisingly, was not that easy to implement, especially when he faced, on day one, the Great Recession, and had to focus on that necessarily. But all the time, all along the way, we see him looking for the opportunities to advance this vision, but doing it in a way that is pragmatic. Mike coined the term a reluctant realist. So it's pragmatic in the sense of being a realist in his approach. But he's not just adjusting to events and trying to do the best he can. We do feel that he has a strong sense of where he wants to take America and the world. And what has emerged in his first 3 years is that there is a considerable gap between the vision and the result. And that's partly because of who he is, because he's not just a progressive, not just a liberal. He is a pragmatist. He is a compromiser. And we see that so much in the way that he handles domestic politics, but you see it very clearly in the way he handles foreign policy. And we could make the argument that that's good. That's been good for the country. And we do argue that, in terms of bottom line, the nation's interests have been fairly well protected. But there's no breakthrough moment. There's no inspirational, transformational events under this presidency. What there is, and I think he would accept this, is kind of slow progress where he can make it towards the overall objective of improving the world.
Mike, you want to jump in, but let me pose this. I mean, in theory, is it possible that ultimately the pragmatism overwhelms the progressivism, or the progressivism undoes the pragmatism? I mean, it's a very nice to postulate a perfect balance between pragmatism and progressivism, but in the real world, of course, they may clash, and I think you might even point to instances in this administration where they've clashed. But do you want to take a crack at that and expand on what Martin's been saying?
Yeah, I'll add a word there, and I thought Martin did a very good job of summarizing the generally favorable review of how we believe he's handled near-term issues. But I think on broader issues of grand strategy and vision, he really has been, in a sense, too ambitious. Now, to some extent, the world intervened, and he had to deal with crises and immediate challenges that, in some cases, were greater than he could have possibly anticipated when he began his campaign for president. In other cases, are just what any president ultimately does in dealing with an inbox. But I do think that having sold big visions